Welcome to Cinemed. This is the story of a spy named Hercule, who arrives in Jerusalem to solve a case. A valuable item has been stolen from a church, and 3 priests are accused of the theft. Hercule begins his investigation at the church where the crime took place. After thoroughly examining the scene, Hercule addresses a crowd, which includes the inspector who invited him to Jerusalem to solve the case. The 3 priests, treated as suspects, stand before everyone like criminals. But Hercule shocks everyone by declaring that all 3 priests are innocent. He explains that the thief escaped through the roof, leaving footprints on the wall. The footprints were made by shoes with thick soles, shoes none of the priests wear. In fact, the only person with such shoes is the inspector himself. Angered by the accusation, the inspector says, "I called you here to solve the case. If I were the thief, why would I invite you?" Hercule calmly responds, "You'll know the truth soon. I've sent some men to search your house. Let's wait and see what they find." At that moment, one of the men searching the inspector's house returns. The shocking twist comes when Hercule's team finds the stolen item hidden in the inspector's house. It becomes clear that the inspector himself is the thief, and he is immediately arrested. Everyone is amazed by Hercule's brilliance, as he solved the case effortlessly in just a few hours. This is nothing new for Hercule. His sharp mind has helped him solve thousands of cases, making him one of the most famous spies in the world. As Hercule prepares to leave Jerusalem, he receives an invitation to America to solve a special case. Though he had been planning to take a break from his work, this case seemed important. To travel to London on his way to America, Hercule boards a luxurious train called the Orient Express. The train is exclusive, with only 12 compartments, and serves business-class passengers. Just 12 to 13 people are traveling from Jerusalem to London on this journey. Among the passengers is a man named Richard. During the journey, Richard finds a threatening note in the bathroom of his compartment. The message leaves him terrified. Frightened and unsure of what to do, Richard seeks out Hercule, knowing his reputation as a brilliant spy. He shows the note to Hercule, hoping for his help. Richard tells Hercule, "I know my life is in danger, and I want you to take responsibility for my safety. If you agree to protect me, I'll pay you $15,000 for just a week." This was a huge sum of money in those days. However, despite the generous offer, Hercule declines. He knows Richard's reputation and is aware that he isn't a good person. In fact, he's a notorious gangster. That night, Hercule and Richard's compartments are next to each other. As the train rolls on, Hercule senses something unusual coming from Richard's cabin. He steps out to investigate. He also came across several other pieces of evidence, but Hercule quickly dismissed them as planted, left behind to mislead the investigation. The only clue Hercule believed was genuine was a small, burnt piece of iron. Upon closer inspection, he realized it contained a hidden message. By placing it under the light of a red pen, the message became clear. The message on the burnt piece of iron revealed an ominous clue. After reading it, Hercule turned to the train manager and said, "This isn't an ordinary case. This murder is a revenge killing, a blood feud, and it could get even more complicated." Hercule then shared a tragic story about Richard, explaining why someone might want him dead. "Richard was responsible for one of the saddest murders I've ever encountered," Hercule began. He recounted the case of a little girl named Desi Armstrong. Richard had kidnapped her from her home and demanded a huge ransom from her family. Despite receiving the money, Richard heartlessly killed the girl. The tragedy didn't end there. The girl's mother was so devastated by the loss that she died of grief. Tragically, she was pregnant at the time, and her unborn child was lost as well. Hercule added, "The girl's father, Armstrong, was completely broken by these events. He hired me to investigate his daughter's murder, but before I could reach him, he took his own life on the anniversary of his family's deaths." The train manager was shocked. "How do you know all of this?" he asked. Hercule replied, "I was involved in the investigation at the time. Many lives were destroyed because of Richard's actions." Back on the train, Hercule met a passenger named Howery, who approached him nervously. "The killer came to my room last night," Howery said, his voice trembling. "I even told the train attendant about it." The train attendant had not believed Howery's story, dismissing his claim about the killer visiting his room. However, she gave Hercule a button she had found, suggesting it might belong to the killer. Hercule examined the button carefully and immediately recognized it. "This belongs to a train attendant," he said. But there was only one attendant on this train, and he had seen her uniform. Every button was intact. Therefore, the attendant couldn't be the killer. With this clue in mind, Hercule began investigating the other passengers and made his way to the princess's compartment. "Do you know a family named Armstrong?" he asked her. The princess replied, "Yes, I knew them. I was Daisy Armstrong's godmother. I used to teach her about religion." Hercule was stunned. Daisy Armstrong was the same girl Richard had murdered. "The Armstrong family? What does this have to do with the case?" the princess asked. Hercule explained, "The man who was murdered last night, Richard, was responsible for the deaths of the Armstrong family." The princess's reaction was surprising. She relaxed and said, "Thank God he's dead. I hated that man." Hercule's suspicions grew. He couldn't understand why the princess, upon hearing of Richard's death, was so relieved. "If it wasn't you," he thought, "why would you feel so at ease about his murder?" The princess then pulled out a handkerchief from her belongings, showing it to Hercule. "I found this with Richard," she said. "Do you recognize it?" Hercule took a closer look. "This handkerchief is very expensive," the governess remarked when she saw it. "It's not something I would keep with me." Hercule thought for a moment. He remembered that the governess's name also started with the letter H, and the same letter was stitched onto the handkerchief. This was the link he needed. Continuing his investigation, Hercule concluded that the killer must have worn the train attendant's uniform to blend in. Perhaps the killer had hidden the uniform in his luggage. He began checking the luggage of all the passengers. To his surprise, he didn't find anything unusual in anyone's bag. However, when he opened his own luggage, he discovered something shocking: a red gown. This was the same gown he had seen a woman wearing while fleeing Richard's room the previous night. Hercule began to laugh, realizing how clever the killer was. "This person is mocking me," he said. "They're turning this murder into a game, making it seem like an accident." The investigation continued, and soon they checked the luggage of the governess. To everyone's shock, they found a train attendant's uniform inside her bag. The strangest thing, though, was that the uniform was missing a button. At this point, the suspicion shifted toward the governess. However, Hercule quickly dismissed the idea. "The governess didn't commit the murder," he said. "If she had, she wouldn't have hidden the coat in her luggage." As the investigation continued, someone noticed a strange smell coming from the coat, a faint scent of alcohol. The train manager recognized the smell and recalled that Richard's accountant had been caught sneaking alcohol from the train earlier. The group decided to question the accountant. When they approached him, the accountant, realizing he was in danger, tried to flee, but Hercule swiftly stopped him. As they confronted him, the accountant nervously confessed, "I didn't kill Richard. Look, I admit that I wasn't honest. I used to steal money from him. But think about it. Why would I kill the man who made me so much money? Richard was like a golden goose for me." This confession made Hercule pause, realizing that the accountant had a point. He was profiting from Richard's wealth, so killing him didn't make sense. Now, Hercule's doubts grew. He began to question everyone, unsure who could be trusted. In the end, the accountant was cleared of suspicion. Later, Hercule sought out the doctor, who had been traveling on the train to London, hoping he might hold a clue to solving the mystery. Hercule turned to the doctor and said, "You're the only one on this train who smokes. I found this cigar in Richard's room, and it's clean. There's no sign it's been used." The doctor, surprised, quickly replied, "I'm a doctor. I'm here to save lives, not take them." Hercule then asked, "I've seen few people like you become doctors during this time. Are you particularly special?" He was referencing a time when people of African descent were often denied opportunities and treated as inferior by the British. The doctor hesitated for a moment before answering. "I was a sharpshooter in the army. I saved the lives of many officers. In return, they helped fund my medical studies." Hercule's curiosity grew. "If you served in the army, did you ever know a Colonel Armstrong?" The doctor's response was swift. "I don't know anyone by that name." Hercule wasn't convinced and decided to visit Richard's accountant again. He asked, "Do you know anything about Colonel Armstrong or his family?" The accountant nodded and replied, "Yes, I do. Colonel Armstrong was a very good friend of my father's. When he passed away, my father fought his case. Unfortunately, Hercule could not convict anyone despite all his efforts. The pressure to solve the case mounted on him, and in his frustration, he wrongfully accused the Armstrong family. The governess, devastated by the false accusation, took her own life in despair. By the time the truth came out that Richard was the true mastermind behind the murders, the governess was already dead. Hercule was filled with regret when he learned of this tragedy. And because of this false accusation, my father ended his life," the accountant confessed, his voice breaking. At that moment, everything clicked for Hercule. He turned to the accountant and immediately proved him guilty. "I knew you were behind this," Hercule said. "The smell of alcohol from your coat was a clue. You wanted to avenge your father's death, so you became Richard's accountant. You stole from him, then killed him to cover up your crimes." Just as he was about to confront the accountant further, they heard a scream coming from another compartment. Everyone rushed to investigate and found that Harvard, another passenger, had been stabbed in the shoulder. The doctor quickly removed the knife from his wound, but the incident only added to Hercule's frustration. Hercule initially thought the accountant was the killer, but he quickly realized he was wrong. The real killer wasn't the accountant, it was the same person who had just attacked Harvard. Now Hercule had to figure out who this person was. Every time Hercule thought the case was solved, it seemed to unravel even further. But he didn't give up. He began another crucial round of investigations. Hercule interrogated everyone on the train and soon found himself in the room of a couple. Inside, he discovered a note with the girl's name that was written on her passport. Upon closer inspection, he noticed that the letter H was written before her name. Hercule immediately recognized it. "Her name is Helena," he muttered to himself. However, the H had been scratched out and replaced with an A, making it Alina. Curious, he asked the girl, "Why did you do this?" The girl nervously replied, "Because you found a handkerchief with the letter H on it. My husband and I didn't want to be drawn into your suspicion, so we erased the letter H from my passport." Hercule's suspicions deepened. He wondered if this couple was involved in the murders and possibly even responsible for attacking Harvard. As he continued investigating, Hercule learned something shocking. Daisy Armstrong, the murdered girl, was the daughter of Helena's sister. This made everything much clearer. Helena had a motive. The deaths of her sister and family seemed like the perfect reason for Helena to seek revenge on Richard. Feeling more certain that Helena was involved, Hercule moved forward with his investigation and eventually met a nurse who had cared for Daisy Armstrong. That day, because of her carelessness, the nurse had failed to stop Richard from kidnapping Daisy Armstrong. Hercule confronted her, saying, "I know you killed Richard to take revenge for what he did." Before she could respond, a gunshot rang out, and someone shot Hercule from behind. A figure touched his shoulder and quickly disappeared. Hercule realized it wasn't the doctor who had shot him. It was someone else, a skilled shooter. Then, to everyone's surprise, the shooter stepped forward and confessed, "Stop the investigation. I'm the one who killed Richard. He was my greatest enemy. He murdered my best friend, Colonel Armstrong, and wiped out his entire family. When no one else stood by us, Colonel Armstrong was the one who helped me. I couldn't let Richard go unpunished for what he did." Just as the confession was made, the train suddenly jolted, and everyone felt shocked. Hercule realized the train, which had been stalled by the storm, had just powered back up and was now ready to move again. Before the train could depart, Hercule gathered all the passengers for one final meeting. Standing before them, he declared, "I know none of you are the killer. Even the doctor who just confessed to the murder is not the real killer, but the mystery of the murder is still not fully solved." Hercule continued, "I understand two possible stories behind Richard's death. One is that the killer came into Richard's room dressed as an attendant. After killing Richard, he escaped through Mrs. Howard's cabin window. This is supported by the button found in her compartment. However, I have my doubts about the second story. I don't believe it myself. None of you strike me as the type to commit such a crime. But all my suspicions and evidence point to each one of you in some way. Let me explain. Hercule looked at each of the passengers. First, Dr. K. You became a doctor because of Colonel Armstrong, and you owe him your career. You've admitted you killed Richard to avenge your friend's death, but I don't believe you are the killer. He turned to the next suspect. Second, the nurse who cared for Armstrong's daughter. You were careless that night, possibly because you were drunk, and that's how Richard was able to kidnap Daisy Armstrong. You might have had a motive to kill Richard in revenge. Third is Helena. Richard was responsible for the deaths of your sister and your niece, Daisy Armstrong. You, too, had a reason to seek revenge. Hercule paused and then moved on. And fourth, the princess. You were Daisy Armstrong's godmother, the one who taught her about religion. You loved her dearly and were devastated by her death. Then Hercule turned his attention to Mrs. Howard. And Mrs. Howard, the person who was also attacked by the killer, she's Daisy Armstrong's grandmother. Hercule's words left the room silent, but the train manager, growing angry, spoke up. If they are all the killers, then who attacked me? Hercule replied calmly, You still don't understand. All of them were united in this plan. Look at the accountant. He wanted to avenge his father, who had been affected by Armstrong's death. The accountant and the train attendant both belonged to the family of the girl accused of Armstrong's murder. They wanted to avenge their sister's death, Hercule continued. This police officer and the man sitting beside him were Colonel Armstrong's good friends. Armstrong helped them both secure bank loans, which allowed them to start their businesses. His death impacted all of them, and together they all killed Richard. Hercule paused as the room absorbed his words. Mrs. Howard slowly stood up. Her face was tense with regret. Yes, we all did it together, she confessed, her voice trembling. But it's not everyone's fault. It's just mine. All this planning was mine. She continued, I've been planning this for years. I sent the accountant to Richard according to my plan to do a job, so that one day he would be forced to travel with us, and we could kill him whenever we were ready. I also arranged for the attendant to be assigned to our train, ensuring that our plan would work without interference. Everything went according to our plan, Mrs. Howard continued, her voice filled with a sense of finality. And so we killed Richard. To make sure you were cleared of the murder, we planted evidence everywhere. She paused for a moment, looking down. I even got myself stabbed. The doctor was the one who did it. He stabbed me in a place where it wouldn't cause much harm. The knife was meant to make you think the killer had run away after committing the crime. You kept chasing the wrong lead. Hercule, hearing this, felt a deep sadness. He knew Richard wasn't a good man, and while Richard deserved punishment, he also understood why it was done. Hercule placed his gun on the table, looking somber. I can't lie. If anyone asks me about this murder, I'll have to tell the truth. And it's better that you kill me now than have me expose all of you. A heavy silence filled the room. Everyone looked at him in sorrow. Mrs. Howard, in her grief and regret, reached for the gun quickly. Hercule was already walking away. She pointed the gun at him, but in the end she couldn't bring herself to kill him. Instead, she turned the gun on herself, ending her own life. It turns out that Mrs. Howard didn't have any bullets in the gun. Harcourt had already removed them earlier. He had been testing everyone, seeing if they had the courage to kill. In the end, they all passed his test. They weren't killers. They had only taken their revenge, and now Harcourt decided to save them all. The journey resumed, and Harcourt spoke up. What you did was right. I'll get off at the next station and tell the police that a stranger entered Richard's room, killed him, and then escaped through Mrs. Howard's cabin window. At that moment, everyone had newfound respect for Harcourt. They were amazed at how he had solved such a complicated mystery in just a few days. With a final farewell, Harcourt left the train at the next station. He needed to give the police all the details of the murder and close the case. And with that, the story ended.